Welcome everyone to another edition of Wildcard Wednesday. It is June 17th, 2026, and I am Stacy Buck, President and Senior Consultant at RadRx. So this week we're going to take a look at two different cases, and the first one is rather complicated because of the documentation. And then the second one is just more straightforward and a quicker one. So we're going to spend most of our time here on case one. So this one came to me because this is a scenario where renal imaging was performed via a renal artery, a transplant renal artery. And so there was a question as to what the correct coding is, considering that the common iliac artery is being accessed to go into the transplant renal artery that is present. So that was why this case was submitted. This one, oh my goodness. This is, I think, take three, four with me recording this, because every time I go back through it, I'm like, no, wait a second. I got to stop and I got to like double check. So I think I've put all the possible scenarios. So basically with this report, when we scroll to the end of it, you're going to see that I have four sets of codes that are possible for this case based on what actually happened. Okay. So the documentation is difficult to follow. There is a lengthy numbered procedure list, and then there's a very small like narrative with a few paragraphs, but they don't jive perfectly. They don't line up perfectly. So there are some questions there. But what I did was normally I would just go through the numbered procedure list and get a feel for the procedure and get an idea of what I'm looking for. And then I would drop the codes into the report itself so you can see where they come from. But in this particular case, I put the codes on the numbered procedure list. And then I also dropped some in that narrative that we're going to see in the technique section, because I wanted you to be able to kind of put the pieces together. So I put the codes where they were applicable, but know that you sometimes have to look at the numbered procedure list and what's in the narrative to arrive at the final code. So anyway, that's how I approached this one a little bit differently because of how the documentation is laid out. So, okay, so let's jump into this. So we have our moderate sedation that was documented, and we have 210 minutes. So that's going to be 99152 and 99153, and that's 13 units on the add-on code. And that would be if you're coding for the facility. If you're coding in an OBL, you're going to be able to pick up that add-on code. If you're doing Profi, then you're going to drop you're going to have the 99152. And depending upon payer, you would drop the 99153. Many just pay for the initial code there. So let's look at our procedure list. So here we have actually on the procedure list 15 numbered procedure steps, and then we have the technique with a short summary of this. So again, we have to piece together the numbered procedure list and the information and the technique to arrive at final codes. So let's go through our procedure list first and see what we have. So we have the ultrasound of the right groin noted in step 1 and step 2 for the ultrasound guided vascular access, which of course is 76937. When we jump over and look at the technique section, it is going to mention that the image was permanently stored. So we have our 76937. Step 3 mentions an arteriogram of the right common femoral. And then this was performed to see whether or not the vessel was amenable to percutaneous closure device placement. So this particular portion of the procedure is going to be bundled no matter what. This would not be coded with a 75710 because this is simply to determine whether or not that closure device can be placed. So that's not even a factor in coding. Step number 4, now this is where we get into the first portion of the procedure where imaging is actually performed. So the catheter, remember the physician gained access to the right common femoral, then the catheter goes to the right common iliac artery, and then right common iliac arteriography is performed, and then it mentions that it demonstrates perfusion and visualization of the transplant renal artery and graft, and we have some other findings there. We see also here in number 4, it says left groin access is required, which is what we're going to see in number 5. So here, whether or not to assign a diagnostic angiography code is going to come down to whether or not this particular imaging that's being performed in this session is truly diagnostic in nature. So our overarching question, you always want to go back and look at the criteria in the CPT manual, but the main question that you want to answer to make the determination is, was the decision to intervene based on this angiography that is occurring? There is nothing in this report that indicates to me that the decision to intervene was based on this study. So what I would do if I were coding this case is I would go back and I would look at the medical record and I would look at notes prior to the intervention and then see if the physician mentioned something else in the medical record that said, angiogram with possible intervention. That would tell me that the intervention wasn't planned. Or you might see a plan where the physician says that they, plan an intervention for this patient. So if it was already determined that they were going to intervene, whether you're doing an angioplasty, placing a stent, whatever the case may be, if that's been determined prior to the patient coming for the procedure, then the imaging is not diagnostic. And so this is something that I've talked about in depth in most every episode that I've done, because it's really one of those areas in coding I think is the most challenging because we don't have that documentation in the report. So right now, as this report stands on its face, let's say I had access to no additional information, I would not code the imaging. But if the person who submitted this case, if you determine by going and reviewing other information about this patient and you determine that criteria was met, then you could report the 75710. And I added the 52 on here because it's talking only about findings in the right common iliac artery. We're not actually doing like a full extremity. So that's why I appended the 52. And then ultimately, if that ends up being assigned, you will need an XU modifier on that, or a 59 modifier, since you're submitting it with an intervention, if you determine that it's appropriate to report that. So steps 5 and 6, we see now ultrasound access on the left side via the left common femoral artery. So we have another 76937. So I put the excess on there. If your payer doesn't accept the excess, you're going to put 59 on there. And then we see step number 7 mentions selective catheterization of the left external and common iliac artery, and subsequently the right common iliac artery. So what happened initially is the catheter stayed on the right side, and then now we have a left access where the catheter is crossing over. I'm sorry, it was accessed on the right side, the catheter stayed in the right side. I think I may have misspoke. Now we have an access on the left where the catheter is going to come across the aortic bifurcation and go back into the right extremity from that second access. So at that point, that would generate code 36245 if we're looking at that coming from the left common femoral access. Now there's a question a little bit further down in the report about, well, which access was it done through when we start getting into the report a little bit further. But at that point, that's what we would have had. So step number 8 mentions selective catheterization of the transplant renal artery. So now, again, if the imaging is diagnostic, that determination has been made, then code 36251 is going to be assigned for that imaging, and then the catheterization was actually going to be bundled with the 36251. But then if that imaging code isn't assigned, then you're going to have the ability to report the appropriate catheterization code. And the appropriate catheterization code is going to depend on, was that work done through the left access or was it done through the right access? Further down in the report, you can't make that determination. Based on this ordering, it appears it's done through the left. However, when we get further down, you'll see where there's a missing link. So number 9 mentions IVUS. We see other mentions of IVUS in 11 and 13. So IVUS was done in one vessel. So we're going to get 37252. This was IVUS in the same vessel. And then for the angioplasty of the transplant renal artery, you will have 37246 for the angioplasty, and then you'll have 36246 for the catheterization code, assuming you're not assigning 36251, and 36251 was done through, that's the thing. We don't know. I'm assuming it was done through the left access, but the other components we can't necessarily tell when we get further down into the report. But because the physician said that he had to get a left access to do the intervention, I feel comfortable calling this done via the left, which would give us the 36246 when it goes over to the right, because the right common iliac artery would be the first order in that case, which then would make the transplant renal artery off of that vessel a second order vessel. Okay, so where do we have the disconnect in the report here? Well, we see here initially we have a match. We have access of the right common femoral. Then it mentions the imaging, the right common femoral arteriogram. I mentioned that was bundled, so I put a note to see back to number 3. Then we go down to the second page here, and it says, or page 4, actually, this document, the second page with the narrative there, where it says we have the catheter was advanced over the wire to the right common iliac. Angiography was performed with findings above. See number 4. So when we go up to number 4, we see here that it mentions selection and catheterization of right common iliac, and this is where we were questioning the 75710. So that's what that's referring back to. That's what that matches up with. Then it says the transplant renal artery was briefly selected and catheterized through the base catheter with a microcatheter. Okay, it doesn't mention imaging. So if we're looking at catheterization, that's going to be a 36245. Okay, again, assuming that it is actually done through the right access. Okay, so here's the challenge that we have, is that step 8 indicates the imaging of the transplant renal artery was done via the left axis. I'm sorry, the first code, I'm assumed in this first paragraph, it was done via the right. And so therefore it's a first order, okay? But step 8 indicates that imaging of the transplant renal artery was done via the left, not the right, okay? But this indicates possibly via the right access. So the ordering of how this happened, there's a conflict between the numbered list and what we're seeing here as far as what's occurring. So that's the question on this case. So now we see where it mentions, left-sided access was required, and it mentions it here. So we have our ultrasound guided vascular access. Then we see that this is where the IVUS catheter was placed. And then we see the angioplasty actually occurring over here. So we know the intervention was done through the left access. That was the whole reason why the left access was gained. So that's a 36246 when you're coming over from the left common femoral over into the common iliac is a first order, which is going to make that transplant renal artery a second order. So that would be a 36246 for the catheter and a 37246 for the angioplasty. But again, we need to make the determination, was the imaging diagnostic in nature? And then if so, which access was it truly done through? Because whichever access it's done through, that catheter placement is going to end up being bundled. That's why it's important to know. So if we're going to assign the 36241, either we're going to bundle the 36245 or we're going to bundle the 36246. So I hope this explanation is making sense going through this report, particularly to the person who submitted the report. You definitely challenged me with this one, with the way the documentation was laid out. So bottom line, there are questions here that need to be answered in order to arrive at final codes. So I listed the 4 possibilities that we have based on answering these questions and making the final determination. So one of the things we need to know is whether or not the renal, so first of all, we need to know whether or not the renal angiography was diagnostic in nature. If it wasn't, then we can strike out some of these possibilities, right there. So if we have renal angiography via the left access where criteria is not met, then you see that we have the 2 catheterization codes and the angioplasty code. If we have renal angiography via the left access and then criteria is met, now you see that we have a 36251 there, and then the 36246 goes away. But then if it's done via the right access and the criteria is met, then we have the 36246 and then the 36245 goes away. So This was kind of my best analysis of the case, the way that it is. If you can't get any additional documentation and you can't tell, I'm trying to think, how would so I can narrow this down to two possibilities. If you don't get any additional documentation, and we're going to assume the criteria is not met for diagnostic angiography. So that's going to leave us with the two possibilities here when criteria is not met. So the last question to answer is, which access was the angioplasty performed through? And then that's going to make the determination. So the question here is, do I trust my procedure list more, or do I trust my narrative, the paragraph here, more? That's what it's going to come down to. So with this, it says the artery was briefly selected and catheterized through the base catheter with microcatheter due to angle origin. So then it looks like it switched access. But notice here, the missing component is we don't see, oh no, here we go. CO2 angiography was utilized to, okay, there we go. So angiography was done through the left. I actually had like overlooked that particular thing. So if that is done through the left access, then that means we're going to end up with numero uno. So based on what I see here in the report, the first one highlighted in purple is what I'm going to go with if I can't get any additional information for this particular case. So to the person who sent me this case, this one really took me a while with the going back and forth and trying to decipher the documentation. So I feel for you if you have to code from reports that are documented this way, it can be a little bit challenging. So really the case itself, as far as like the coding, it's not that difficult. If you have clear documentation, I think the coding is pretty straightforward. So going back to the original question, when you have the renal, transplant artery, you got the transplanted kidney, you're going to treat that just like you would as if it was a native kidney, as far as that's concerned, when we're looking at code 36251. So that was the main question that was asked. Okay, so let's look at case number 2. So this is a short one. This is an easy one after that one. So the question that came in on this, does this case really support CPT code 36573 due to lack of documentation on ultrasound and fluoro guidance, no documentation of imaging saved for 76937, and no documentation of an image of final position of cath? Does 77001 require a permanent image to be saved? Should this be downcoded to 36569? So looking at this report, there's not much in here. It does mention ultrasound guided vascular access. It doesn't have any of the requirements, so we can throw that out the window, like right there. It's not going to qualify on that. But it does say that the PICC line catheter was placed over the guide wire and negotiated to the SVC using fluoroscopic guidance. So it says that fluoroscopic guidance is used, and we only need one form of guidance to be able to report the 36573 for a PICC line. And what I actually did was I pulled from my book where I have information on this. I actually pulled a quote out from there, and there were 2 points that I pulled out from my Cracking the IR Code book. And so the first one there is that PICC insertion does not require the use of both fluoroscopy and ultrasound guidance. However, PICC insertion, when performed under ultrasound guidance only without use of fluoroscopy, requires all of the potential access sites, the patency of the vein, the real-time visualization, the permanent image. And then if these elements are not documented when only ultrasound guidance is utilized, then you're going to use 36568 or 36569. And then another note is that modifier 52 is appended to 36572 or 36573 when confirmation of final catheter tip placement is not noted. So coding of this is going to depend upon how picky you want to be when you're looking at this report. So as far as fluoroscopic guidance like that, there's CPT doesn't talk about a permanent image for fluoroscopic guidance. It talks about permanent image for ultrasound guidance, okay? So here we've used fluoroscopic guidance. So the question is, with the statement that's there, it says that it was negotiated to the SVC utilizing fluoroscopic guidance. Now we can draw an assumption that was the final catheter position. You can make that connection, okay? And so if that's the case, then you wouldn't have modifier 52. But if you want to be super picky about this and say, okay, it doesn't say confirmation of final catheter tip placement, then you could put a 52 modifier on the 36573 for this case. But here's something else with this case that I made a note of. You'll see where it says ultrasound guidance was utilized to gain access with the vein. I asked the question, which vein? Because the access determines whether or not you have a PIC or whether or not you have a central insertion. Now, I'm assuming that it was via, that it wasn't a central insertion because it's calling it a PIC line. But when we're making that determination there, you would want to know which vein was accessed. Because let's say it was the basilic vein. Okay, then we know that this is like a PIC. But then if it was via the jugular, let's say, then it's going to be central. So how you're going to code placement of these catheters, of these lines, is going to be, is it a central insertion or is it a peripheral insertion? And the vein tells you that, and we don't know the vein. So again, I'm gonna, believe that the physician correctly called this a PIC line. And based on that, with this documentation, I would probably let it go with a 36573. But again, if you wanted to be super picky, you may want to add the modifier 52 onto that code if you don't feel comfortable with that statement there. So I think whether or not to use modifier 52 is just simply a judgment call. So hopefully you found that helpful. And thank you to everyone who have submitted cases. If you're listening, I do need some more cases. There were some I received that I couldn't put out for various reasons. Sometimes I get cases where the documentation, I can't even work with it, or there are just certain cases that if I don't have like a lot of knowledge and expertise, if it's like more peripheral to what I do, pardon the pun, then sometimes I'm like, yeah, I don't feel comfortable discussing this case publicly if it's like, if it's a complicated endovascular repair. I don't do a lot of those. And if I do have those, I have other coders that I reach out to and discuss those cases with. So if you have something like that, and people have submitted them, I let them know if they submit a case that I can't cover in an episode, I do, let them know. So if I haven't told you no on your case for a specific reason, then you should see your case in a future episode. So again, thank you for tuning in. I know this episode was a little long because of that first case, but I appreciate all of you, and keep sending in those cases so I have some good ones to look at. I want to do this on a weekly basis, but I need the cases to keep coming in. So sorry I missed last week. I was busy doing an audit. But yeah, hopefully I'll be back next week with a couple of more cases. So please send them in. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and have a great rest of your week.